Okay, so hello, Sofia. For the French reader who don't know you,
Hmm.
could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Um, so I am a writer of science fiction and fantasy, and recently I've also started writing some memoir. So I say that I'm a futurist, a fabulist, and a memoirist. I think that's the best way to describe myself. I've been writing for a long time, but my work only started to be published about 5 or 6 years ago. And I've written two novels, both set in the same fantasy world, an alternate world that I created called Alondria. The first book is A Stranger in Alondria. This is the one that's available in French. The second one is The Winged Histories, and that came out last year in 2016. And then just in April of 2017, my short story collection came out, which is called Tender.
Okay. Before you being a writer, you were a teacher in Sudan,
Mm-hmm.
in Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
and after that in California.
Mm-hmm.
Why such a job in first place?
Okay.
And what are the benefits for you when you decide to write fiction?
Okay. Yeah. Um, so yes, teaching is sort of teaching is my profession. I'm still a teacher now. So after South Sudan, Egypt, California, now I have a new job which is in Virginia. So that's where I live now, and I'm an English professor at James Madison University in Virginia. Um, so yeah, I sort of have a double career, and I like it that way. It makes me very busy, but it also means that my writing, which I've always done, in fact, I was writing before I was teaching, my writing, I don't need it to pay the bills. So I always have a teaching job so that I can live, and that means that with my writing, I'm very free. I can write anything that I want. I don't have to worry about whether it's going to sell or not, and I don't have to kind of change anything about it in order to make it sell. I don't worry about that. And that's very, very important to me. And so I think what I would add also is that there's always a relationship between those different parts of my life. They're very connected. So, for example, I traveled for my teaching, as you mentioned, to South Sudan, where I lived for 3 years, and to Egypt, where I lived for 9 years. And so the atmospheres of those places really informed my fantasy world that I created. And also, my teaching itself appears, especially in the short stories. So in the short story collection, there's a story called How to Get Back to the Forest, which is a kind of near future dystopia where the young people are separated from their parents and kept in these terrible kind of camp schools that they're told it's supposed to be fun, but as the story goes on, you realize they're really more prisoners than students. And that story is really about my anxiety of being a teacher because I love teaching. I love teaching university students. But at the same time, sometimes I worry as I'm correcting their papers, and I'm making them write in the correct way, that I'm somehow, that there's something oppressive about teaching. Sometimes I try not to make it that way, but sometimes it feels that way. And the other example is the story Walk Dog, which is also in Tender, which is written in the form of a student paper with all of the spelling mistakes and everything. And the student is writing a paper, and then in the footnotes, she's telling the truth about her life. So there's also, you know, an interaction between my teaching and my writing.
You started publishing in 2012?
Yeah.
With a short story?
Yes. I think actually, I sort of forget, but I think it was in 2011, at the end of the year, that I published poetry in Stone Telling magazine, which I believe was my first kind of creative work to appear. So 2 poems. But then, as far as fiction, it was 2012 when the short stories started
And
appearing.
why the short form in first place?
Well, that's a good question. I'm a natural novelist, so for me to write a novel feels very comfortable. And I started writing short stories for 2 reasons. One is that I was, at the time, in graduate school, so I was doing a doctorate in African languages and literature, specifically Arabic literature, so studying Arabic literature of Africa. And so I had to write papers for class, and I had to write a dissertation, and so I was working on this big project. So for my creative work, then I started to do the shorter form because it was very hard for me to do a long form, a novel, at the same time as my dissertation. So that was one reason. The second reason is that I had sold my novel, A Stranger in Alondria, which was written before, to Small Beer Press in, I think, 2010 or something like that. So I knew, 10 or 11, so I knew that my novel was going to be published, but I was completely unknown to readers. I didn't have a blog, I was like invisible. And I thought, if I have a novel coming, maybe it's a good idea to be a little bit visible. And if I write some short stories, and if I can get them published, then people will know my name before the novel comes out.
Immediately, you use folktales and mythological creature in your story. Why this choice in particular?
This choice is made from love. I think many people who are interested in fantasy have a real love for mythology and folklore. Actually, you find many of us who have studied it and who have, who are really deep students of mythology and folklore. And I would like to be able to say why we love these stories, but it's such a big question, and it's very difficult to explain, because for me it's so natural to be drawn to fairy tales and to folk culture that I just wonder, who are the people who don't like it, and why would anyone not like it, So it's sort of hard to explain. It's hard to explain what it comes from. But I think part of it is a sense of interaction with the past. I think that as much as we think about the future, we also, as humans, we need to remember the past, and we have a need for some connection and interaction with what has gone before us. It's very rich. It's very rich, and there's a sense of richness in interacting with something that you didn't make up. I mean, partly it's your imagination, but also it's the imagination of others that from the past that you're drawing on, and I think that that creates a certain richness.
Your first novel is Stranger in Alondria.
Mm-hmm.
This was published in 2013, I think.
Yeah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You choose a fantasy world, but a very uncommon one, because you have a very intimate perspective on it with your main character. Jewik is not a warrior. Is just a merchant.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you want this kind of hero for your story?
Mm-hmm. Um, I think partly because of the subject matter of the novel. So the novel is about travel, and it's about exile, and it's about nostalgia, and it's about very complex feelings for home. How much we love home, how much we miss it if we lose it, but then also our problems with home and how much we can be critical of home as well. And so I was going to have a character who was on a journey, and it was very important for me to really create a world that felt almost, three-dimensional, a world that felt real, that had that you could visualize very clearly. You could sense the air, you could sense the smells, and so on. And so my traveler was going to be somebody who would notice what was around him. And so I made him a merchant, but that's, just his job, how he gets there. But he's really a student. He's a student. He's not from Alondria, but he's a student of Alondrian language, and he's a student of Alondrian culture. And this is a very different perspective from a warrior. If I'd made him a warrior, he has a certain purpose in going to a place. His purpose is to conquer. His purpose is not to look, to notice, and to immerse himself in this other culture. So it was really the student perspective that I wanted in order to bring the reader into Alondria in a way that would encourage the reader also to recognize the place and to really feel it.
In the same way, you don't use many fantasy creatures. In fact, you mainly use an angel.
Mm-hmm.
And can we say that your novel it's a light fantasy world? And why don't you choose to use more fantasy creatures in your novel?
Yeah, well, I always say that when I set out to write the novel, I wanted to put into it everything I love about fantasy, because I love this genre very much. I love epic fantasy very much. But I wanted to leave out all the things that I don't care about or I find boring. And so actually, I'm what I love about fantasy, I love the idea of moving from place to place, of discovering new places, discovering new worlds. I love fantastical languages, and I had a lot of fun because there are a couple different languages. Jevik has his own language, and then in Alondria there's a different language, and then Alondria is an empire, so there are even several languages inside it. And I really enjoyed imagining these languages. How does each one work? But I'm always bored by the battles in fantasy novels. Every time I come to a battle, I start, flipping the pages quickly. It feels very routine to me. It's just a repetition of, heads are falling and rolling, and it really doesn't interest me. So I kind of left that part off. Now, as far as magical creatures, I said actually yesterday I had an interview and I said, there are no dragons, and I don't because I don't care about that. And then the interviewer read an excerpt from the novel in which actually dragons are mentioned. So I say like Castenia is the land of dragons or something. So there is within Alondria a mythology that includes dragons. And I do actually like magical creatures. And I must admit that in the second book, there is a very magical creature, which you can see on the cover, because the cover is one of the characters from the novel, and she's riding on a giant bird with these huge wings. So there are more fantastical creatures in book 2. but book one, A Stranger in Alondria is really, it's about travel and it's about reading and writing and literature and the idea that that literature gives us contact with the dead, with people who have died. And so that's why there's this emphasis on the angel, who we might call a ghost, who is someone who has died, who comes into contact with the hero.
Also, you talked a lot about religion things in your book. What is your point of view about all this religious matter, and are you a religious person yourself?
Yeah. So I am Mennonite, which is a small Protestant group. It's historically it's a peace church, so a very anti-war church, and this comes to me from my mother's side. So all of my mother's side of the family is Mennonite. All of my father's side, so my father, who passed away about 2 years ago, was Somali. So all of my father's side of the family is Muslim. So I'm, in some ways, I'm between these two, world religions, which are Christianity and Islam. And I have, although I am Mennonite myself, I have a lot of affection for both of those traditions. And this position that I'm in my own life is what creates my interest in how different religions exist in the same space. And so in A Stranger in Alondria, you have, and of course, as we know, they often find it difficult to coexist peacefully. It doesn't mean they never do. There are times, historically when people of different faiths live together, without any problem. But there are also, I think, many cases in which it's a situation of conflict, and that's been my experience during my lifetime, especially, that we see a lot of religious conflict. And so when I wrote the novel, I was interested in exploring a moment of almost a crisis in Alondria between an older form of religion and a new one that has just arrived.
And for all this work or this word, what was your inspiration?
Yeah. Well, for me, I'm a reader first. I think most writers are, and if they're not, they should be. So all of the writing comes out of reading and the things that I love. And there are a couple of different streams of inspiration that I draw from. One of them is classic, fantasy. J.R.R. Tolkien is a giant to me and a huge inspiration from when I was a kid, especially with the languages, because I study languages and I love his interest in philology and the way that he created his languages. Also, Ursula K. Le Guin, a very important figure for me. And finally, Mervyn Peake, who maybe is not as well known as the other two, but he wrote the Gormenghast trilogy, which I think what inspires me with Mervyn Peake is that he's one of he's a great example to me of a fantasy writer who really cares about language. So he's created this weird castle where these people are living, and in fact, in Alondria, there's a giant castle that the palace where the king is also a city, and this is like Gormenghast exactly. It's one building, it's a castle, but at the same time, it's a whole city. So that was a direct, Mervyn Peake, a theft really from Mervyn Peake. But I also love the way that he takes his time, creates his characters, and has this immensely rich, very, very poetic language. And he's not in a rush to get to the next plot point. So that was a big inspiration for me as well. So that's kind of the fantasy stream that goes into my writing. And then the other stream is just other work that I love that's not classified as fantasy. So when I was writing A Stranger in Alondria, I read all of Proust, the In Search of Lost Time, and I love it. In fact, I've read the whole thing twice, and I just think it's amazing in terms of his ability to insert emotion into landscape and to draw emotion out of landscape also. So that was very inspiring to me. Marguerite Duras, another writer who I read again and again, especially when I was writing the part which is in The Voice of the Angel. That's really like a Duras voice. And then Michael Ondaatje, who wrote The English Patient, he's a Canadian writer that I love a lot. So all of those writers, in terms of their technique and the way that they use language, were very important for me as well.
You have another publication in French, but it's a short story this time, in Blind Spot number 11.
Mm-hmm.
It was Onebir. This one is nominated for one of the greatest prize in France, Grand Prix de l'Imaginaire.
Mm-hmm.
And when we read this story, it's the same that you tell in Stranger in Alondria, because it's unconventional extraterrestrial invasion, in fact, and where how do you form this idea of this kind of unconventional extraterrestrial invasion?
How did I form the idea? It's hard for me to remember where it came from, but I would say a lot of I think new ideas, when we have new and unconventional ideas, they don't come out of nowhere. It's more that they are taking old ideas, but they're mixing them and recombining them in a new way so that they kind of reinvent them. And I think in Honey Bear, it's a story about extraterrestrials, but it's a story also about human beings who try to find a place. They try to insert this very new thing into their imagination in order to comprehend it and understand it. And they do that through a return to folklore. So they imagine these completely alien beings, and they're trying to also explain this to a child. So, and they do that through fairy tale, and that's I think that's how human beings operate. Is that there are periods where we're not used to the new, and when we're not used to it, we have to explain it in terms of the old. So you have, when you first invent an automobile, it looks like a horse carriage. Like it's not, nice and streamlined the way a car should be in order to deal with the wind and everything. It just looks like a horse carriage with no, it's a horseless carriage. And then after that, you can slowly adapt to the new.
It's a way to understand, have a better understanding of this invention, in fact.
Yes, and a way to prevent yourself from actually sort of losing your mind in the face of something that's so new. I mean, we can be completely overwhelmed and sort of paralyzed by the shock of the new. And so our brains quickly start inventing or asking, okay, what categories do I have? Do I have any category that can admit this new thing? Well, it's an extraterrestrial being. It's airborne. It has wings. It's a fairy.
And you're also a poetess. You publish poetry.
Mm-hmm.
What is the connection between your work in poetry and your work in science fiction?
Well,
a fantasy word.
Oh yeah, well, and some science fiction too. Yeah, I think it's I think the interesting question is sort of the relationship between poetry and fiction and why write both of them. It's actually my dream someday to write a whole novel in poetry. But I think this is very annoying to readers. And I know people who, I know some people have tried it, have done it. In fact, what was his name? I think it's Vikram Seth, has a book called Golden Gate or something like that. Anyway, it actually is rhymed poetry, the whole thing. And even I couldn't read it. But there are others, I think of the poet Anne Carson. She's a Canadian poet. She's one of my favorites. She has a wonderful book called Autobiography of Red, which is she's taking a character from Greek legend, and she imagines his life, and it's the whole, it doesn't rhyme, which is good for me, but it's poetry, and it's a whole novel in poetry. I love this idea, so and my novel, A Stranger in Alondria, also has a lot of poetry in it, so there's a lot of quoting of poetry. I like narrative poetry, and I like the mixture of poetry and narrative, and poetry that tells a story. And I never thought of myself as a poet until I discovered that there was such a thing as speculative poetry, which is poetry, science fiction and fantasy poetry. I never heard of it before until I discovered magazines like especially Stone Telling, which Shweta Narayan and Rose Lemberg were running this online poetry magazine, and it's wonderful. I mean, it's just, I thought, and when I read it, I thought, oh, I think this, maybe I do write poetry. I think this is what I write, and I think that's because science fiction and fantasy is a very story-oriented genre. It's really, it does go back to these older forms of mythology and fairy tales that tell stories. And so when you have poetry that is using science fiction and fantasy, often it is narrative poetry. It's poetry that also has a story to it. And I really love working in that space.
Stranger in Alondria won 2 major prizes. What do you feel when you received it? And are they affected your work in some way?
Oh, that was just so incredible for me. First of all, to be published was incredible because I worked very hard to get published, and I was unsuccessful for a long time. I actually looked, after I wrote A Stranger in Alondria, I tried to find an agent, which is what we have to do in America, because you can't contact publishers directly. And I tried for 5 years unsuccessfully to get an agent, and I never did get one at that time. So finally, I connected with Small Beer Press, and they were very happy with the book, and that was already enough. That was already very exciting. And then to have a debut novel from a small press to really be recognized and nominated for awards and even winning some of the awards, that was just amazing. As far as has it affected my work, one thing I was very happy about when I look back is that I did not begin seeking a publisher for A Stranger in Alondria until the first draft of The Winged Histories, the second book, was also written. So I actually wrote, because I always imagined Alondria as the books as these kind of companions, these 2 books that would go together. Not a big series, but the two novels. So I wrote both of the novels first, completely. And then I began, of course, I had to revise them for many, many years, but I had the first draft before I started looking for publisher. And that was good because then when A Stranger in Alondria did so well and, had these awards, it didn't affect the second book the writing of the second book because the second book was already written. So I didn't have any temptation to like try to do Alondria again or something like that because I already had a very different text that was written.
And can you tell us more about your second book?
Yeah, sure. So the Winged Histories, when I say it's a companion to A Stranger in Alondria, it means it's not exactly a direct sequel. So each one can be read individually. You don't have to read both of them. But it also answers some of the gaps that are in A Stranger in Alondria. So A Stranger in Alondria is written from the perspective of a stranger. He's not a native Alondrian. So the second book is set completely in Alondria, and all of the characters are Alondrian people. Also, in the first book, you have a male voice through most of the story, and we meet some Alondrian women, but the female voice is also the voice of the angel, who is also not from Alondria. So in the second book, then, it's the story of 4 Alondrian women. So the book is in 4 sections, and each section has a different main character, but they're all facets of the same story. So one of them, of these 4 characters, one is a soldier, one is a poet, one is a scholar, and one is sort of a socialite. She's like a high society, noble woman. And there are different relationships between them. So 2 of them are sisters, 2 of them are lovers, and then one of them, a couple of them are on different sides of the war that's taking place in Alondria. And so the story is called The Winged Histories. It is about history. It is about memory, and especially it's about what happens to certain voices, especially the voices of women, because Alondria, like my own society, is a patriarchal society. What happens to the voices of women in times of conflict? And do their histories remain and become sort of canonized and get retold, or are they the kind of histories that fly away?
And for the end, same question that I asked to Joe Walton. Who are your favorite writer of the moment?
Well, a couple of them I can mention. One of them, who's actually here in Épinal, is Catherine M. Valenti. I really think that she is, if I had to choose one person who is sort of bringing the most life to the genre, I would pick Catherine Valenti. I think that she has a wonderful use of language and just a joy. She has a real joy in invention, both in terms of plot and also in terms of language. She's very inventive in both. My favorite book of hers, I asked some people, and they told me it's not available in French, but in English it's Palimpsest, which is a wonderful novel about a sexually transmitted city. So the city, only when people have sex can they enter the city. And to go to this city, you have to have sex with somebody who's been to the city. It's a really very original and very beautifully written and very exciting novel. I love it. Another writer I would mention is Jeff Vandermeer, who has actually, had a lot of success recently with his novels, especially the Southern Reach trilogy, and he has another novel, Born, that has just come out this year. And he has a great kind of ecological sensibility, and he's really he's very observant. He's very good about writing environment and human interactions with environment. I love one of his older works, which is City of Saints and Madmen. That's kind of this, compendium of texts from this strange city, and that's absolutely one of my favorites. Wonderful. He also, of course, along with his wife, Anne Vandermeer, they are fantastic editors, and they're really, they make great anthologies that I think are bringing a lot to the genre, and they are some of the people who are doing a lot to bring writers in translation. So their big anthology, The Weird, is one that I really love, and it has a lot of translated work in it, and was an introduction for a lot of American readers to many writers that they never knew before.
Last few words for your French reader.
My last words are that I look forward to and I long for more interaction between literature, fantasy and science fiction in English and fantasy and science fiction in French, and especially more translation. I read French, but very slowly, with a lot of difficulty, with my dictionary beside me. And being here in Épinal, I'm walking around this big room full of books, full of writers, and there are all these wonderful, I know they're wonderful because I see big lines of people are waiting to get these books in French. And I wish that we could have these books in English. I just really, I don't have a solution. I know it's the whole process of translation and publication is very complicated. But I think this is someplace where writers who are working in English and writers who are working in French, somehow we should put our heads together and try to come up with some solutions to these problems. How can we get more translation, and how can we make more of our works available to each other? Because it's one of the greatest things you can do to enrich your writing and to enrich your genre is to read works from other places and from other languages.
Thank you.